There's Liam Halligan, economics editor of GBNews. Put this in simple English, Liam, because it sounds desperately complicated.
It is desperately complicated. Well, let's think of the national debt. That's the amount of money that the government owes. That's doubled in the last decade to £2.3 trillion. That's 23, followed by 11 zeros. It's serious money. It's 95% of the size of the entire economy, what we call gross domestic product. And everyone knows about that, and the government pays debt on that interest, and it's monitored quite closely. But there's another debt that's even bigger. It's 2.6 trillion. It's bigger than the size of the economy, which means the national debt we talk about, quite literally, Nigel, isn't even the half of it. Because there's another whole national debt that represents the huge gold-plated, very, very generous pension entitlements of public sector workers. Now, I'm not talking about the basic state pension that we're all entitled to as long as we make our contributions over our working life. I'm talking about the pensions for the fifth of us, it's just under a fifth, who work in the public sector. That's NHS workers, police, and in particular civil servants, mandarins in Whitehall and elsewhere. And their pension arrangements are far, far more generous than those of us in the private sector enjoy, even though we pay for their pensions with our taxes. And it used to be argued often, and you'll often hear it said now, that, those public sector workers, they get much lower wages than the private sector. But they don't. The average public sector wage is about 8% higher than the private sector, and it's been higher for years. And then they get the massive pension entitlements, taxpayer backed on top of that.
I mean, this is almost like pensions apartheid, isn't it, between the public sector and the private sector? But isn't the real racket here that so many in the public sector are retiring at 60?
Well, there have been reforms in recent years, which means people join the public sector now. They join what's called an average salary scheme, and the retirement ages for those are later. But for people who are in existing schemes, many of them who've joined quite recently, Nigel, they're enjoying pension arrangements that were designed 50 years ago when people lived 10 years less.
So what do we do, Liam? I mean, we can clearly stop these gold-plated pensions for those that come into the civil service or whatever public sector it is now. But with the existing people, I mean, we're a country that likes to keep its promises.
We do, but we don't want to have a race to the bottom, but many people with gold-plated final salary schemes in the private sector, they've lost those pensions. They've had to fall back on something called the Pension Protection Fund. They don't get their inflation indexing. They don't get their pensions uprated each year for prices, as they were promised when they made years of contributions in the private sector. Look, our demography is changing. We all need to share the burden of that change, but it strikes me that an awful lot of people in the public sector are getting huge pension entitlements that are completely unrealistic, given that that's a guaranteed income every year for the rest of your life, and we're living, 5-10 years more than we were when I was born not so many decades ago.
Well, I have to say, the fact the national debt actually is double the size that it really we believe it is. Final thought, Liam, Citibank saying inflation could go to 18%. You were writing in the Sunday Telegraph this weekend about your fears for strikes this autumn. Perhaps groups of unions, not quite a general strike, but groups of unions coming together. Goodness me, Liz Truss is going to face, if she wins, one heck of a challenge.
Well, she is most likely to be Prime Minister. It is going to be a baptism of fire. It's not so much the private sector unions, though we are hearing, of course, about strikes at Felixstowe, private sector union. In theory, the train drivers are a private sector union. But only 12% of us who work in the private sector are in trade unions these days. In the public sector, Nigel, it's over 50%, back where it was in the bad old days of the 1970s and the winter of discontent. And my concern is, and there's already the drums are beating across the public sector, that increasingly militant public sector union bosses are going to really test an incoming Tory Prime Minister. There could easily be a political crisis. I think if the civil service strikes, if the nurses strike, if the teachers strike, pretty much all at once, they'll be saying, we get paid less. They don't. They get paid more on average than the rest of us, and they won't mention their pensions.
I tell you what,
it could cause a political crisis. I think, Nigel, I don't like to say this, it could even topple the government at some stage.
Well, we'll see whether she